This panel discussion tonight is going to cover a couple different topics: relativism, truth claims, and a Christian worldview. We got some distinguished guests, which will be introduced here in a second, to help us walk through that. There will be multiple opportunities for the audience to do Q&A. So take a seat, stick around, and during those in-between times, it'll be about every 15 minutes, we'll open it up for y'all. Please gather at the mic with our host, Ryan, 2 or 3, and we'll do questions. And we're just hoping that the rain chills out for a second. So with that, for tonight's panel discussion at Roosevelt, I introduce our host, our moderator, the man with the golden mic, Ryan Smeets. Tell us what's up.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. We've got a great panel here tonight, and I'm going to get started by introducing our panelists. And then, try not to lose my chair. And then we'll get started. First up, we have Professor David Wendt. Hi, Professor David Wendt. He is a professor of philosophy and world religions at Central Arizona College. He's also a musician at large and interested in languages. Thank you for coming tonight. Also, we have Professor Ryan Taylor. Professor Ryan Taylor teaches in the College of Theology at Grand Canyon University. He has his Master's in Divinity from Reformed Theological Seminary, and he also sits on the board of St. George's Anglican Community Church, which recently opened the 8-Day Cafe just down the street. So make sure you check that out this week. He's been married for 14 years, has 3 kids, enjoys studying redemptive history and theology, comparative study of Eastern and Western traditions, enjoys hiking, camping, and exploring. He's the most interesting man on the panel so far. Let's keep going. Who else do we have? We have Pastor Bobby Brewer. Yes. He holds his doctorate in Christianity with a Postmodern Context from Phoenix Seminary. He's the pastor of spiritual formation at City of Grace Church and also hosts a weekly radio show. In his spare time, he mountain bikes, reads Superman, like this guy over here?
Right, there he is.
Okay.
Right there.
And he keeps his 1983 El Camino waxed up.
That's right.
Nice. Is it a car or is it a truck?
Well, that's a great question. That's a relative question.
Okay, so we'll get to that.
Yeah, I say truck.
Okay.
So,
Like the Baja, right? Like
yeah,
the Subaru
exactly.
Baja.
Right.
All right, and he's also the author of a book on postmodernism, so you can talk to him about that a little bit later. As Vocab mentioned, we're really going to have about 3 parts to this discussion. So we're going to start with defining truth. I'm going to ask a couple questions, and the panelists can respond. We'll kind of just jump around, and everybody can kind of weigh in on the question. And then at certain times, I'll ask the audience, if we can get 2 or 3 people at any time, just line up behind me, and feel free to ask questions as they come. So first off, we want to define truth. First question is, do people individually decide what is truth? You could start us off, please.
Yeah, well, they do. I mean, you hear a term, sometimes we'll hear people say, well, that's relative. What's the difference is there's objective truth versus subjective truth. So subjective truth would be that I think that In-N-Out Burgers has the best French fries, and that's really true for me, right? The objective truth would be the main ingredient is potatoes for French fries. So people do, in some ways, they define their own truth, and you'll have people who they'll maybe be pro-life for saving the whales, but pro-choice when it comes to humans. So in some ways you can say yes, it depends on whether it's objective or subjective.
Anybody else have anything to add to it? Nope. Okay, we'll keep going then. Let's go over to Professor Ryan Taylor. Are all ethical theories equally sufficient?
I don't think so. I think we could examine a number of ethical theories, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that this evening. I don't think they're all equally sufficient. I think we could say some are better than others. We could look at an ethical theory that would say my self-interest is the most important thing. That's an ethical theory, right? Whenever I come to a moral decision or some type of important decision, what matters is what's best for me. Another ethical theory would say, hey, what matters is what's best for the greatest number of people, what creates the greatest amount of good. Well, those are 2 different ethical theories with maybe 2 different responses in a particular situation. Other ethical theories might be based on different principles. But to say that they're all equally valid. No, I don't think that's true. I think some of them are objectively better than another one.
Let's move into moral codes. Can a moral code be wrong?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Can you give an example?
Here they gave the example of egoism. Egoism is an ethical theory that says what gets me what I want is the right thing to do. So from other worldviews that have more of a deontological idea of ethics, that is, there really is an ethical thing in and of itself that's distinct from me and my feelings, that would be wrong.
I would say, too, moral codes we've seen they've changed over the years. Just here in the United States, there was a time when women couldn't vote. Today, most people would say, well, that was wrong. Even though we were mostly a Christian nation, at that particular time, there was a time where ethnic minorities couldn't vote. And so moral codes can be inaccurate, and this goes back to relativism, where sometimes they transform depending upon how a society develops in its own worldview over time.
And I think even the Nazis had a moral code, right?
Absolutely. And I would say that moral code was incorrect.
Right. So even if you want to claim to be a relativist and saying, you have your truth, I have my truth, or something like that, I think most of us would agree that the Nazis had an immoral moral code. So we want to make an objective statement about the Nazis' moral code. That was a moral code, though. Even the people within that system thought they were probably doing the right thing, being moral. But from an outsider's perspective, now we say, well, even if everyone thought that was a good, even if everyone was brainwashed and ended up thinking that the Nazis did a good thing or something, that would still be objectively morally wrong. So a moral code could certainly be wrong. Slavery, in the South in the 19th century, perhaps there was a moral code that accepted slavery. Most of us today would say, well, that was an inaccurate,
What
invalid
dictates
moral
a
code.
moral code being wrong? Is it the sign of the times? Is it the trends? Can you kind of extrapolate a little bit more on that?
Well, for followers of Jesus, the Bible is the canon, as some theologians call it. It's the moral code for us, and God has revealed to us His moral code through the Scriptures. And so if a culture isn't using Scriptures for its moral code, they're left to their own ethics, which we can only hope are very, very good moral codes. This is why, like right now, we're seeing a lot of the issue is homosexual marriages right now. I believe that more and more states will ratify and make it easier for homosexuals to have marriage because they're moving away from the moral code of the Scriptures. Rather, they're basing moral codes upon society. And so the way law is based in a culture that doesn't use Scripture, so basically they'll ask the question, does this cause any physical harm? Okay, so if it doesn't cause any physical harm, why is there a law against it? Okay, so this is why, not that I agree with it, but I just think more and more you'll see more and more states as we become more and more postmodern, more and more states will ratify something like a homosexual marriage, for example.
So the Bible might be one answer. Of course, that would be from a Christian theistic perspective, obviously, that you would look to the Bible as a source of authority for morality. Even other Christian positions might say all people throughout all time and all cultures have a natural law, even from a Christian perspective. You might say God built that into them. We have a conscience, an awareness of good and evil. It's helpful to have the Bible from a Christian perspective to make sense of those, but this natural law that's within all peoples can also guide you, and so even cultures, Christians could say, look, you still know the difference between right and wrong, even if you don't have the Bible in your culture or something like that. You're still held accountable.
Right.
From a naturalistic worldview where there is no supernatural, there's no objective morality, simple as that. Relativism has to be true from that point of view. There's no way that anybody who holds that point of view could coherently say that Hitler is wrong or that slavery is wrong. All they can say is, boo on Hitler, boo on slavery, yay on what I like. A person can't coherently believe in an objective morality from that worldview.
Interesting.
Now, to be fair, I should say that, or we should say, even some atheists, from an atheistic perspective, may want to embrace objective values, objective morals. You might want to base it on, as long as we're simply doing good to other people and not doing harm to other people or creatures. And from that, we can base objective morality on. But the challenge with that is what significance does that have in the long run, in the big picture? And secondly, what obligation do you have to that? Why do you have an obligation to be kind to other people if there's not any kind of transcendent authority, meaning something outside of humanity? What obligation do you have to follow that moral code? That transcendent authority is what Christians call God, what Plato called the good, or something like that.
The question is, what warrant do you have for saying that something is better than another from that particular worldview? But we need to be careful talking about atheistic worldviews, since there are different types of atheistic worldviews. Sure. Jainism is a dualistic religion that is atheistic. Same with some forms of Hinduism like Raja Yoga. It's a dualistic worldview that assumes that everything is uncreated. And yet in those, they want to have some sort of morality, and their morality is really based on what you want. You want to quit reincarnating. So the right thing to do is whatever it takes to quit reincarnating. So it ends up not being an objective morality really, but more of a, if this is what I want, this is what I do.
Yeah, see, to me, the question here is who determines what's right and what's wrong is the bottom line. So with relativism, it's up to a person or a society. They determine their own worldview as to it's like an a la carte. They get to pick, and most relatives, obviously, they think they're right, and everyone else would be incorrect. So, like even with reincarnation, who decides what you get reincarnated as? Who makes that decision that you lived a good life and therefore you get to come back as a rock star as opposed to a cricket? Who decides that?
Tough question for someone who believes in reincarnation.
And I think you pointed out one of the inconsistencies with relativism as well, self-contradictions within relativism. You think you're right and other people are wrong.
Right.
Well, if there is no ultimate truth, ultimately, how can you be right and somebody else be wrong? And it's very difficult to really find somebody who's a consistent relativist, because you would just have to throw up your hands and say, well, you're right and I'm right, we're both wrong, which very few people want to say that. Secondly, we should make the distinction too between what kind of relativism we're talking about. I think focusing on moral relativism in our discussion here, we can talk about epistemological relativism, or metaphysical relativism. We can't really know anything about anything at all. Very few people really want to embrace that. Most all of us believe that 2 + 2 = 4. And we think that if you don't believe that, then something's wrong. And somebody living 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago in another part of the world believed that true. We think that's an objective truth, and most people want to embrace that. Say, okay, we can believe that 2 + 2 = 4 objectively. But when it comes to religious matters or ethical matters, well, since there's so much disagreement on that, we're just going to be relativist about that. Well, I'm not sure that those things are necessarily in a different category. Maybe we just need to discover that there's objective truth regarding those issues as well.
Even mathematics requires certain axioms. So in some forms of language, 2 + 2 would not equal 4. In base 10 it is. But in some other base system it may not. So you have to have some assumption going on to talk about anything.
Yeah. Foundational assumptions, foundational knowledge.
Yeah, this is, the term chosen people, for example. What were they chosen to do? Well, they were chosen to point people to the one true God, in a culture that had many beliefs, that was very polytheistic, and you have a book like Leviticus and Deuteronomy means second law. So that's one thing that's pretty crystal clear about the Bible. It's claiming to be the way. The Bible makes no mistake, and you don't have to read between the lines when the Bible saying this is the moral code as revealed from the scriptures, from God. So the Bible's pretty upfront. That's what I like about it. There's no, there's not mystery. There's not all this philosophizing. It's just straight up, thou shalt not, in some cases, with like the 10 Commandments.
Well, to be fair, there are some Christians who have a radical discontinuity between the Old and the New Testaments. It's hard to decide with which of the 613 laws are applicable to New Testament believers. So there's some debate about that.
Yeah, well, the laws there were ceremonial laws that existed when there was like a theocracy. There were civil laws, though, about not, moving boundary markers when you shouldn't move them. And, of course, there's moral laws, thou shalt not kill. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, the Bible's not crystal clear as to which is which. And so that's where it takes a little bit of research and study. But they all had a purpose, though. Even Jesus, Jesus brings a new law. He brings when he gives a Sermon on the Mount, he's like saying, look, here's a new way. That this, like we're having all these political debates right now. Well, Jesus is saying, this is my platform. This is what I believe. Blessed are the merciful. They will receive mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers. They'll be called the sons of God. So, he'll say things like, you've heard, you shall not commit adultery. I say you shouldn't even lust after a woman. Right, so he brings even a different standard. He enhances it even further.
Even there's debate about whether he's adding to it or simply interpreting it the correct way. But I agree with you about the laws, and it seems to me that there's some laws that are based upon the nature of God, the nature of man, as in natural law theory, like you're talking about. Other laws are ceremonial, or there's some sort of positive laws that can come and go.
If we have any folks in the audience who would like to ask a question, feel free to just come up right behind me and tap me on the shoulder, and we'll go ahead and field your question. If not, we did bring up a good point on relativism and the definition of it. So I'm going to go ahead and read one, and then we'll ask a couple questions to kind of flesh it out a little bit. So, yep.
Can you guys talk a little bit more about what you said in the very beginning, like subjective versus objective, kind of like things that are certain versus, I guess, what you might call preferences or opinions about things. What is the difference between those two things, or are they really different, those kinds of choices? Ice cream, murder, how do those differ in their moral quality?
Well, you got subjective and objective once again. So again, subjective maybe is more of like a preference. I prefer In-N-Out burger French fries, all right? The objective is that they're made out of potatoes, all right? So there's people who believe that we were on a flat earth at one time. Okay, that's what they really believed. But we know now with some certainty that we're on a spherical planet, and so therefore they would have been wrong. And so there's times where you can see where there's changes. And like I was saying with the United States, there was a time when it was illegal for minorities to vote, right? Even though it was a society that was mostly based on Judeo-Christian ethics and values, and yet somehow they weren't applied. And so when it comes to morals, that's why we have to absolutely, for me, it's a pretty easy answer because I believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, and I'm a follower of Jesus. So for me, that answer is a pretty easy one, that a moral code is revealed through the scriptures and through the life and ministry of Jesus Christ.
Objective truth is a proposition that conforms to reality, to what the universe is. Subjective truth is something that's not very clear, and it probably is a statement that a phrase that shouldn't be used. If someone says In-N-Out is the best restaurant in the world, that's not what he means. What he means is it's my favorite restaurant in the world, or something to that effect. So if people state things more accurately, I prefer this restaurant to that, even that's an objective truth. The person really does or really does not prefer that restaurant. I can lie and say, I prefer McDonald's to Taco Bell. But if I lie, it's not a subjective truth, it's an objective lie. So there's preference on the one hand that people confuse with subjective truth, because you're talking about my subjective feelings. But we need to be really careful with that.
Yeah, I think it's important to make that distinction between subjective feelings of an individual and an objective truth. Another example would be 3 people are in a room, and one says it feels very cold in here, another says, no, I think it's very hot in here, and the other says, no, I think it feels just fine. And see, truth is relative, right? Because all 3 of these people have different views on well, it's 70 degrees in the room. That's an objective truth. If it's 70 degrees, now one person might subjectively feel cold, and one person might subjectively feel hot. whatever, that's a subjective feeling. But the objective truth, it is actually one particular temperature. We can't deny that. Sometimes this, there was a famous poem which I'm going to tear up about the blind men and the elephant. If you've probably heard it, a number of blind men are feeling an elephant, different parts of the elephant, the legs, the trunk, the tail. Okay, there you go. Different parts of the elephant. They all think it's something different, right? They all come up with something, the ears and so forth. They all think it's a different thing. And so sometimes this is pointed to as an example of, see, we all have different perspectives on truth, and truth is what you make it, truth is what you see. But even the analogy itself, that story itself, even points to the fact there is an elephant. There is an objective elephant. There is something that it is, whether or not they've understood that truth correctly and objectively or correctly understood what that objective truth is. But there is an actual elephant in that example. So even though they might have a different subjective experience of that objective truth, that elephant, there is an objective thing there.
Right. Morally, though, to get back to the question, see, this is where I think it's somehow postmoderns or relativists are able to live with contradictory theories. They probably don't process it out that way, but to me the classic example is the fact that a particular individual will be pro-life when it comes to whales and yet pro-choice when it comes to humans. To me, that's just like an exhibit A of how relativists, they kind of a la carte, they very freely pick and choose how. Well, based upon their own, in my opinion, mostly subjective feelings or subjective philosophies.
Or just based on contradictory worldviews that they hold.
Right. And they're able to live with those contradictions.
Because nobody's come along and put them right next to each other and said, take a look at this.
Right.
Got a question here?
Yes. Does the idea of theism really solve the problem of objectivity? There is a concept in meta-ethics called the Euthyphro dilemma from one of Plato's dialogues. And the question is really
Do you mean the Euthyphro? Excuse me.
Yeah, sorry. The question is whether goodness is the essence of God, and thus whatever God subjectively does is defined as good, or whether goodness is an objective standard apart from God. And if it's the former answer, then the question is it really any horrible thing that we attribute to God by definition good? But if it's the latter, then how is God solving the problem of objectivity if it's a standard apart from him?
That's very simple, actually. The Euthyphro question can be answered from different points of view, different worldviews. For instance, from a Platonic worldview, the demiurge looks at the forms or something that's independent of himself, and he says, I learn from that. The same is true from an LDS worldview, where God has a God, he learns from his God. From an Islamic worldview, whatever God says, it's right simply because he says it. But from a Jewish Christian worldview, it's different, because morality is based upon the nature of God and the nature of man. So the Euthyphro question is really a false dichotomy. It's asking this question: does God love X? Does God's loving X make it holy? Or does the fact that it is holy, somehow independent of God, cause God to love it? And the answer is neither one. God's nature is such that the thing in question is holy, and God's nature is such that the thing in question is loved by God. So it's like a false cause or a false dichotomy. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Did anyone else understand that question? I'm just kidding. So, all right, very good. Thank you. That's good.
I think it's a fair question. It's asking,
Yeah, it is.
is there something outside of God?
Right.
Theism doesn't seem to make sense. It seems to say there's some kind of force of goodness outside God, and which would seem to say there's some kind of element in the universe that's more powerful than God, which would seem to be contrary to a Judeo-Christian worldview, Christian theism. But the answer given was, look, since the time of Augustine, really, Augustine in the 4th century saying, look, this is God's nature. God's nature is love and goodness, and he acts and gives commands out of his own nature, so he's internally consistent.
Yeah, and to me, this is, exemplified in the ministry of Jesus. you'll notice every miracle Jesus does is a snapshot of how things are supposed to be. Okay, so when Jesus heals a leper, he's basically saying, in my kingdom, there will be no leprosy. All right, when Jesus raises someone from the dead, he's basically saying there will be no death in my kingdom. Right, and so he'll do miracles on the Sabbath. Okay, now the Pharisees had placed rules where you couldn't. You know, in their worldview, you shouldn't be doing a miracle on the Sabbath. All right, Jesus is saying, look, I am Lord of the Sabbath. All right, and so everything that Jesus does is a snapshot of how things should be. So.
One of the reasons that question you asked is so frequently asked is because a lot of Christians hold to an ethical theory called divine command theory. And usually they hold to an ontic view of it, where they say that because God has commanded X, X is good. And that just really doesn't work from a Christian worldview. An epistemic version of that works. Because God has said X, I can know that X is good. So there's the big problem. And a lot of Christians just bite the bullet and say, yeah, just because God said it, so God could have said rape is good, for instance. And so backing up to God's nature and looking at something that's either more of an ontological view of the divine command theory or looking at natural law theory instead as an ethic makes a whole lot more sense. And a lot of Christians have done that instead, especially in various traditions.
Yeah, and there have been even atheistic cultures that have laws, right? I mean, North Korea has laws, right? The People's Republic of China has laws. Soviet Russia had laws. Okay, so even atheistic cultures recognize the value of having some form of, let's call it a moral code, if we want to use that word for it.
All right, we'll fill another question here.
This might just be the result of my misunderstanding of the last question, but I guess if you're defining truth by God's very nature, wouldn't that sort of make objective truth obsolete and make everything subjective, but subjective to God and not subjective to us?
No, God is a being in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology who exists outside of or above time. God thinks all true propositions. God believes, I suppose you could say, or knows all true propositions. So whatever propositions are known by God eternally, those propositions simply are the objective truth. Those can be defined by God. God can tell you what those are, yes.
Yeah, God's the final arbitrator of truth, if you want to answer that. I mean, in my worldview, God's the final arbitrator of truth.
But it's not subjective in the sense that there's a difference between something that's objective and something that is subjective, that humans think. Okay.
I guess there's a unity in the objective and the subjective in God, in a sense, and and that's, you know, from a Christian worldview, that's the only perspective that matters. I'm not saying that's just what God thinks, and therefore I'm not limited by saying everything's subjective to God's point of view. I'm not trying to limit God's perspective or make it equal to other perspectives, but I'm saying that it's that objectivity is defined by one subjective perspective, in a sense, however dynamic and however.
I suggested earlier that it may not be a good idea to talk about subjective truth versus objective, because the meaning is kind of clouded. It's filled with a lot of baggage, and it's like, what in the world does that mean? So maybe something more like that. There is a truth, whether you want to call it subjective or objective. There is a truth that simply is the truth.